A yellow dozer idles beside a wooden silo in the pale March cold, its diesel exhaust curling into the frost above frozen Iowa corn stubble. Four men in canvas coats pry the outer boards free and toss them onto a burn pile at the edge of the field. A 19-year-old in a red plaid work shirt walks toward them across the stubble breath, white hands buried in the pockets of a coat that used to belong to his older brother. The contractor in the new Ford cap looks up from his clipboard unhurried, already amused by whatever the boy's about to ask. What the boy says makes the crew stop working. What the contractor says back travels all the way to the machine shed, where the boy's father stands with his coffee. The boy does not move, does not blink, only counts 87 steps home, as 40 years of accumulated knowledge crackles behind him in the flames. Inside the shed that night, alone with a kerosene lamp, he runs one hand along a single curved plank the county has already decided to burn. What he sees in the grain no one in Hardin County has learned to see yet. The morning came in cold across Hardin County on a Tuesday in March of 1962, the kind of cold that settled into the seams of a wool coat and stayed there through the first hour of the day. Frost clung to the stubble of last year's corn in patches the sun had not yet reached. A crow called once from the windbreak of cottonwoods along the drainage ditch, then went quiet, as if it had said what it needed to say. Emmett Halverson stood at the edge of his father's farm, with his hands pushed deep into the pockets of a canvas work jacket that had belonged to his older brother before it belonged to him. He was 19 years old. He had $73 folded into a small envelope in his back pocket, a quarter-acre of poor drainage ground on the northeast corner of the property that his father had given him, the way fathers give hard things, and an idea that every man in the county who had heard it had dismissed inside of a single breath. The silo in front of him had been built in 1921. 41 years of grain and silage and Iowa winters had darkened its outer boards to the color of wet iron, but the structure itself had never leaned, never buckled, never given a moment's worry to the man who had built it or the son who had inherited it. That man had been his grandfather. That son was his father, standing now inside the machine shed 100 yards away, drinking coffee from a tin cup, choosing not to watch what was about to happen. Some things a man cannot bring himself to see, even when he has agreed they must be done. The demolition crew worked with the practiced indifference of men paid by the hour. A small yellow dozer idled near the base of the silo, its diesel exhaust rising in slow blue coils. Four men moved around the perimeter with pry bars and long-handled hammers, pulling the outer boards down and cracking sheets and tossing them onto a burn pile at the edge of the field. Inside, exposed to the March air for the first time in decades, the staves stood upright in their circle, long, curved, 2 inches thick, white oak the color of old honey where the corn had polished them, darker at the seams, where the moisture had drawn a slow line across the grain. They looked to a man who did not understand what he was looking at, like the ribs of something already dead. The man in charge was Rick Thornton. He wore a new Ford cap over hair the color of wet straw, a leather work coat that had cost him more than most men in the county paid for a good rifle, and the settled expression of a person who had never once in his 34 years lost an argument he cared about winning. Owned Thornton Construction out of Iowa Falls. He had a second crew running foundation work over in Franklin County. He had bid Anders Halverson's job at a fair price for a man of his standing, which is to say a price that assumed the customer would be grateful. He was standing near the dozer with a clipboard in one hand, watching the burn pile grow, when Emmett crossed the frozen field toward him, with his breath white in the air. He stopped at about 6 feet from him. He waited until the older man looked up. Then in a voice that carried no rehearsal in it at all, only the same quiet directness his father used when he asked a neighbor to lend him a hand baler, he made his request. "Mr. Thornton, those staves you're throwing on the pile, I'd like to have them." The silence that followed lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then it broke. Rick Thornton laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was the full-throated laugh of a man who has just heard something so genuinely absurd that he cannot decide whether to be amused or offended, and settles on amused because the alternative would require him to take the speaker seriously. His crew looked over. One of them, a thick-shouldered fellow named Bergstrom, who had been prying at a warped board near the base, smiled through his beard. Thornton took his cap off, wiped his forehead with the back of a leather glove, and let the laugh trail off into something worse than a laugh, which was a smile of pity. His voice carried across the field loud enough for every man on the crew to hear it, loud enough for the sound of it to reach the machine shed 100 yards away, where his father stood with his coffee. "Son, those are garbage. What in the world does a boy your age want with garbage?" He turned half his body toward his crew, inviting them in. "Go on home and study your primer. This is no place for a farm kid with bright ideas." The four men on the crew did not laugh exactly, but not one of them looked at Emmett either. They looked at the ground or at the burn pile or at the sky in the manner of men who have decided the safest thing they can do is disappear inside their own bodies. Bergstrom's smile did not leave his face. Emmett did not move. He did not blink. His breath came out white and even, and his hands stayed in the pockets of the canvas coat. He had prepared himself over the long winter of drawing plans on graph paper at the kitchen table for the possibility that this moment would arrive. He had not prepared himself for how small the humiliation would feel and how large it would be at the same time. Something in his chest closed like a door being pulled shut against weather. Then he opened his mouth, and the words that came out were the ones he had chosen in advance 3 months earlier, when he had known this conversation was going to happen exactly this way. "I want to build a floor with them." Thornton put his cap back on. The smile had already faded from his face because he had already stopped thinking about him. He waved the clipboard toward the burn pile the way a man dismisses a fly. "Help yourself, kid. Take all the garbage you want." Then he turned back toward his dozer, and the crew turned back toward the silo, and the noise of the work resumed as if nothing had happened. Which to Rick Thornton was true. Nothing had happened. A farm boy had asked for scraps and been given permission to haul them off. In his mind, the exchange was already dissolving into the general background of unimportant things a man does not need to remember. Emmett turned and walked back across the frozen field. He kept his hands in his pockets. He did not look toward the machine shed where his father stood. He did not look toward the burn pile where 40 years of accumulated knowledge was being thrown into a heap for the match. He walked with his chin level and his shoulders square, and he made himself count his own steps to keep his breathing steady. And by the time he reached the fence line at the edge of the yard, he had counted 87 of them, and his jaw had not once come unset. Let me tell you about Emmett Halverson, because the young man is the whole story, and everything that came afterward depended on who he already was before Rick Thornton opened his mouth. He was the middle child of Anders Halverson, who farmed 320 acres of corn and beans on ground that had been in the family since 1889, and of Marta Berglund Halverson, who had come out of Story County as a young schoolteacher and had never quite lost the schoolteacher's habit of listening to a person for a full minute before deciding what she thought of them. Emmett was the second of three. His older brother Wendell was 23, married the previous fall working a section over near Ackley with his father-in-law. His younger brother Corbin was 16 and still in school, and still convinced that everything worth knowing could be learned in a classroom, which was a phase Emmett had passed through and come out the other side of at 14. He had finished high school the previous spring in May of 1961. His marks had been strong enough to earn him a place at the agricultural college over in Ames if he had wanted it. The county extension bulletins had a way of arriving in the mailbox with his name written across them in blue pencil by teachers who had noticed him. 2 of them had come to the house that summer, sitting at the kitchen table with Marta's coffee cake, telling Anders that his son was the sort of student who could go far, that the state was expanding its engineering programs in ways that would open doors a farm boy would otherwise never see, that it would be a waste to keep him on land where the ceiling was a milk pail and the horizon was a fence line. Emmett had listened from the other room while he oiled his father's harness. He had already made his decision, but he had let them talk because Marta had raised him to let older people finish their sentences. The decision was this: he had a plan that required him to be in Hardin County and not in Ames. The plan required time quiet, the particular kind of patient attention that a lecture hall did not reward. The plan required above all else that he remain within walking distance of the machine shed, where a certain pile of lumber was going to arrive on a certain morning in March. He had known about the silo demolition since the previous August. His father had been talking about it with his uncle over supper, arguing gently the way brothers argue about spending money, and Emmett had sat listening with his fork halfway to his mouth while an idea walked into his mind and sat down and refused to leave. That idea had come from his grandfather, who had died in the spring of 1958 when he was 15. He had built the silo in 1921. He had told him on a Sunday afternoon in the fall of 1957, when he was 14 and the old man was 79, and both of them were sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the leaves come down off the cottonwoods, a thing about wood that he had never forgotten. He had told him that the staves inside a silo did not stay the same over 40 years. They changed. The weight of thousands of tons of packed silage pressing outward against them did something no manufacturing process could do on purpose. It compressed the grain, forced out any residual moisture the drying kilns had left behind, hardened the outer surface until it approached the density of stone. The staves in the lower third bore the most load and became the densest. The staves in the upper third saw less pressure but more moisture cycling and became something slightly different, springier, more forgiving. A man who understood the difference could sort them by hand and use each one for the job it was best suited to. The Norwegian settlers who had come into the county in the 1870s had known this. They had used old silo staves for the floors of their root cellars because the wood was hard enough to turn a shovel blade, and the cellars they had built with those floors were still standing, still dry, still solid 3/4 of a century later. His grandfather had told him all of this, the way old men tell important things, which is to say, without emphasis, without warning, as if he were simply describing the weather. He had been 14. He had listened the way he listened to everything the old man told him, which was completely because his grandfather was the only adult in his life who never bothered to check whether he was smart enough to follow him. He had assumed he was, and by assuming, had made him so. The quarter acre his father had offered him sat on the northeast corner of the property. It was low, poorly drained, bordered on 2 sides by a drainage ditch, and on the third by the same windbreak of cottonwoods, where the crows liked to gather in November. Nobody had ever farmed it successfully. Anders had offered it to him the previous autumn, not as a gift exactly, more the way a man hands his son a jar with a stuck lid, curious to see what he'll do. What Emmett had decided to do with it was build a house. Not a shack, not a shed, a house. A small, tight, efficient house on a poured concrete slab with good insulation. A simple roof line and enough room for a young man and eventually a family to live in without spending money nobody had. He had drawn the plans himself on graph paper over the winter, 22 feet by 18. 2 rooms downstairs, a sleeping loft above. He had priced out the materials at the lumberyard in Eldora and the hardware store in Ackley and the concrete supplier down in Iowa Falls. What he had found when he added the numbers 3 times to be sure was that the materials alone would run somewhere between $800 and $1,000. He had $73. The gap between those 2 numbers was the shape of the problem he had spent the winter thinking about, and the shape of the solution had been sitting in his father's north pasture for 41 years, waiting for the day it would come down. By noon on that Tuesday, the last of the silo's outer boards were on the burn pile, and the staves stood exposed in their circle, catching the pale March light along their curved interfaces. Emmett brought the flatbed trailer around from the machine shed with his father's Ford tractor. He backed it in past the burn pile without looking at Thornton. Corbin, released from school for the afternoon on the excuse of helping his brother, showed up in his work coat with a set of leather gloves that were 2 sizes too big for him. Together they began to load. There were 247 staves that were still sound. He counted them as he went, running a hand down each one before he lifted it, feeling the grain, testing the weight, checking the ends for rot. Some of them had softened at the top where the silo cap had leaked in the last decade. Those he left. The rest he loaded onto the flatbed with a care that struck Corbin as unusual, given that his brother was hauling firewood. He had not yet been let in on what the wood was for. He had learned by then that his brother told a person a thing when he was ready to tell them, and not before. They made 3 trips before the light went. On the last one, as he was walking back from the trailer with a stave balanced on his shoulder, he passed near enough to Thornton's dozer that he could hear him talking to his foreman. He was not talking about him. He was already on to the next job, describing a foundation pour he had scheduled for Thursday over in Grundy Center, complaining about a supplier who had shorted him on rebar. Emmett was a closed drawer in his mind. He kept walking. He did not look at him. The staves went into the machine shed. He stacked them carefully along the north wall, separated by small wood blocks he had cut the previous week out of scrap 2x4s, so that air could move between them and none of them would sweat against a neighbor. When the last one was in place and Corbin had gone home to wash for supper, he stood in the shed alone for a long time and looked at what he had. 247 pieces of 40-year-old compressed white oak, curved to a 14-foot radius, averaging 8 feet in length, 6 inches in width, 2 inches thick. To Rick Thornton, garbage. To him, something else entirely. Something whose value could not be seen by a man who had never bothered to learn the difference between lumber and material. He spent the next 3 weeks studying them. Not cutting, not building, not planning the next move. Studying. He walked the length of the stack every morning before chores and every evening after supper. He turned individual staves over in his hands. He set them side by side in different orientations on the shed floor to see how the curves behaved when the boards lay flat. He ran his fingers along the grain and pressed his thumbnail into the surface at various points and learned by the resistance he felt which staves had come from the lower third of the silo and which had come from the upper. Some of them, when he pressed hard, his nail would not mark at all. Those were the densest. Those had held up the greatest weight for the longest time. Those were the ones his grandfather had been talking about when he had said on that porch in 1957 that a good silo stave was harder than anything a lumberyard could sell you and would outlast the yard by 30 years minimum. What he was working out in those 3 weeks was the geometry. If he laid a stave flat with the curve facing down, it rocked. If he laid it curve up, it rocked the other way. But if he alternated them one down, one up, one down, side by side across the width of a floor, the curves nested against each other. The whole assembly flattened. Under the weight of the staves alone without a single nail, it locked into a surface that had no meaningful flex. If he ran a thin slurry of Portland cement and fine sand between the courses before the slab beneath had fully cured, the staves would bond to the concrete on the underside and to each other along the edges. And what he would have was a floor of 40-year-old compressed white oak that was, by his calculation, harder and more durable than any new hardwood the yard in Eldora could sell him for 3 times the price. The lumber was free, the knowledge was free, the work was his to do. He brought the idea to his father at the kitchen table one evening in the 2nd week of April. He had rehearsed how he would say it. When the moment came, he did not need the rehearsal. Anders Halverson was not a man who required his children to sell him on things. He required only that they had thought it through, and he could tell within 30 seconds of a person opening their mouth whether the thinking had been done or not. Emmett laid it out plainly: the geometry of the alternating curves, the bond between the green concrete and the compressed oak, the cost comparison against dimensional pine, the estimated life of the floor based on what the Norwegian settlers had done. He spoke for about 6 minutes. When he was finished, Anders was quiet. He looked at his coffee cup. His face gave away nothing, which was his way. He had inherited it from his own father. His voice, when it came, was low and level. How much does the concrete cost? $22 for a slab that size if I mix it myself. 2 sacks of Portland per batch. Gravel from the ditch bank. And the staves are free. It was not a question. He did not answer. Wendell, home for supper with his wife Priscilla, snorted from the far end of the table. He had inherited nothing of his father's quiet. He had opinions the way some men have coughs, involuntary and frequent. His voice cut across the kitchen with the certainty of a man 3 years married and already convinced he understood the world. You're going to live in a shack made of rotten silo wood. That's your plan. Emmett, come on. No woman worth having is going to walk into a house floored with garbage. You'll be a hermit in a lean-to by the time you're 25. The color came up in Emmett's throat. He kept his eyes on his father. He did not turn toward his brother. Something in his chest tightened, not with hurt exactly, more with the specific fatigue of having heard some version of this sentence from every man who had ever felt entitled to an opinion about his future. Marta Halverson had been at the sink with her back to the table washing the last of the supper dishes. She did not turn around. She did not raise her voice. She said into the window above the sink in a tone that carried more weight than anyone at the table would have imagined a tone could carry, "He's right, Anders." Wendell opened his mouth to argue. He got as far as a single syllable before Anders lifted one finger off the tabletop, the smallest gesture, and his oldest son closed his mouth. Priscilla found something interesting to look at on her plate. Corbin, who had been holding his breath, let it out slowly. Anders Halverson looked at the back of his wife's head for what felt like a long time. He picked up his coffee cup. He set it down again without drinking. His eyes moved to his son. Whatever passed between them in that look did not need words. I had watched him over 19 years make small decisions with the same careful weighing that his own father had used, and he had come to a private conclusion about him that he had never spoken aloud, which was that this was the child of his who understood most completely what he himself had spent 40 years trying to teach. His voice was quiet. "Pour your slab." Wendell pushed back from the table. He put his hat on. He said something to Priscilla about wanting to get home before the wind picked up, and the two of them went out through the porch door without another word to anyone. The screen banged behind them. Corbin looked at his brother with something like awe. Emmett kept his hands flat on the table until he was sure his fingers were not going to shake. Then he stood up and carried his plate to the sink, and his mother, still not turning around, brushed the back of her hand once across his wrist as he passed. That touch, the only one either of them would exchange that entire week, was worth more than everything Wendell had said combined. The next morning he drove into Eldora to see the county agent. His office sat above the feed store on Main Street, a narrow set of stairs leading up to a room that smelled of pipe tobacco and mimeograph ink. Hal Whitmore was 52 years old, a widower, thin, careful with his hands, the kind of man who had spent his entire working life explaining to farmers why the new methods from the university would help them, and being told politely that they would not. He knew Anders Halverson. He had known Emmett since the boy was tall enough to reach the counter at the feed store downstairs. Hung told him what he was planning. He asked whether he had any bulletins on slab preparation for high moisture ground. He did not tell him about the staves. That part he kept to himself because he had learned that a person could listen to only one new idea per conversation before their mind closed, and he needed him to help him with the slab first. Whitmore listened. He rolled a pencil between his fingers. When Emmett finished, he opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a thin 4-page pamphlet titled Slab Foundations on Poorly Drained Soils, dated 1959, and he slid it across the desk to him. Then he sat back in his chair, and his face went through a small internal negotiation between the man who wanted to be encouraging and the man who considered honesty a professional duty and honesty one. His voice was not unkind. "Emmett, I'm going to tell you something because your father is a friend of mine, and because I don't want you to spend $73 on materials for a slab that's going to crack in the first freeze. I have seen grown men contractors with 20 years experience pour slabs on ground like that and end up breaking them up with sledgehammers a year later. The drainage on that corner is against you. The freeze depth in this county is against you. You are 19 years old. You have never poured concrete. I would be doing you a disservice if I sat here and told you this was going to work out fine, because in my professional opinion, it is not." He took the pamphlet. He thanked him. He stood up. At the door he paused. He turned back. Something in him had wanted for a full second to tell him about the staves, to lay the whole plan out, and see what a man with a university degree in agricultural engineering would say about the geometry of alternating curves. He did not do it. He had already learned at 19 that when a man had spent 30 seconds explaining to you why you were going to fail, he was in no condition to hear the reason you weren't. His voice going out through the door. "I appreciate it, Mr. Whitmore. I really do." He drove back home with the pamphlet on the passenger seat. He read it that night by the kitchen lamp cover to cover 3 times. It was a good pamphlet. Every technical point it made was one he had already worked out on his own or intended to follow. 14 inches of excavation, 8 inches of compacted gravel, a capillary break between the ground moisture and the concrete above, section pores to control cracking. He underlined nothing because he did not need to. By the third reading he had it committed. What Whitmore did not know, could not have known, sitting in his office above the feed store, was that within 72 hours of Emmett's visit, he was going to receive a telephone call from Rick Thornton. The call came on a Friday afternoon. Whitmore took it standing up because his back had been hurting him that week, and he stood at the window looking down at Main Street, while a voice he had heard at co-op meetings and county board sessions delivered a message wrapped in the sort of neighborly concern that fooled nobody who had been listening for it. Thornton had heard he said that the Halverson boy had come by looking for slab bulletins. Thornton just wanted to make sure Hal knew, in case he was thinking about lending the kid any equipment or making any endorsements, that Anders Halverson was letting his son run wild with the family property on a project that any responsible adult in the county could see was going to end badly. Thornton was worried, he said, about liability. Thornton was worried about the county's reputation for sound agricultural practice. Thornton, more than anything, was worried that a well-meaning county agent might get his name attached to a failure that would embarrass them both. Hal Whitmore listened. He said at the appropriate intervals the appropriate noises of a man who did not wish to be rude to a fellow professional. When Thornton had finished, Whitmore hung up the telephone gently, and he stood at the window for a long minute, looking down at a farmer loading feed sacks into the bed of a pickup. And he found himself thinking about a moment 30 years earlier, when he had been the young man with the new idea, and the older men in the room had explained to him in the same neighborly tone why he was wrong. Whitmore did not know how to tell Emmett about the call, so he did not tell him. But he also, for reasons that would take him some years to understand, did not do what Thornton had wanted him to do, which was to make a follow-up call to Anders Halverson, explaining that the county agent's office could not in good conscience support his son's project. Whitmore filed the memory of the telephone call in the same drawer of his mind, where he kept a great many other things he had learned in 30 years and never spoken aloud, and he went back to work. The rumor, meanwhile, was already moving on its own. Rick Thornton had a habit of stopping in at the co-op counter in Ackley on Wednesday mornings to pick up a newspaper and a cup of coffee, and he had a bigger habit of using those visits to say the things he wanted the county to hear without being seen to circulate them. 2 Wednesdays in a row he mentioned in the general hearing of whoever happened to be at the counter that he had a 19-year-old customer over in the Halverson section who was planning to pour his own slab with mud and prayers and old silo scraps, and that he was personally concerned about what was going to happen when the first hard freeze hit. He said it with a smile that pretended to be sympathetic. He shook his head the way a man shakes his head at a child who has climbed too high in a tree. The men who heard him did not laugh outright. Most of them knew Anders Halverson. Most of them respected him. But rumors do not need laughter to travel. They need only to be heard by a certain number of people over a certain amount of time. And by the 3rd Wednesday, when Emmett drove down to the concrete supplier in Iowa Falls to arrange for the sacks of Portland cement, he needed the man behind the counter, a fellow named Vernon Kyle, who had known his father for 20 years, looked at his order form with a face that had gone flat. His voice was careful. "Emmett, I can't sell you the volume you're asking for on the account. Your father would need to come down himself and sign for it." He held his ground. His voice did not rise. "My father knows I'm buying this. He agreed to it." "I'm sure he did, son, but we've had some conversations here at the yard about liability, about young folks pouring slabs without proper supervision. If something goes wrong, the yard needs to be able to point to the account holder. It's just company policy." It was not company policy. It was Rick Thornton who bought 40 tons of ready mix from Vernon Kyle every month during the construction season, and who had mentioned to Vernon over the last 2 weeks in a friendly way that a certain young man up in the northern part of the county was setting himself up for a mess that he, Rick, would hate to see the yard get pulled into. Emmett understood in the space of about 3 seconds exactly what had happened. The color did not rise in his face this time. Something colder rose in its place. He thanked Vernon quietly. He walked out to the truck. He sat for a moment behind the wheel with his hands flat on his thighs, and he made himself breathe slowly, because if he started the engine while his hands were shaking, he would take a corner too fast and end up in a ditch. By the time he got home, he had a new plan. He drove past the farm and continued another 4 miles to the hardware store in Ackley. The hardware store rented a half-bag concrete mixer, by the day an old orange thing on 2 rubber wheels that had been sitting behind the store since his father was a young man. The proprietor, a small, quiet fellow named Ralston, who owed Anders Halverson nothing in particular, but respected him in the general way a small businessman respects a customer of 40 years standing, rented him the mixer for $2 a day and asked no questions. I bought his Portland cement from him, a sack at a time at retail, which cost him almost twice what the Iowa Falls yard would have charged him for volume. He would have to make 5 trips instead of 1. He would have to load and unload sacks by hand. He would spend more money on gas than he had budgeted for the entire month. He said none of this to his father. He said none of it to his mother. He drove home in the last of the March light with the first sack of cement in the bed of the truck and a knot in his stomach that felt like the beginning of an illness he was going to have to fight off alone. That night, after the house was dark and everyone else had gone to bed, he went out to the machine shed with a kerosene lamp. He lit it and hung it on a nail near the stack of staves. He sat on an overturned crate and looked at the 247 pieces of wood arranged along the north wall, and for the first time since Thornton had laughed at him by the burn pile, he let himself sit with what he had done. Not the laugh he could carry. What he could not so easily carry was the campaign that had followed it, the small, quiet work of a man who was not content merely to have dismissed him, but had needed also to arrange his failure to close the doors he could reach, to whisper in the ears he could bend. I had never once come to him directly. He had not needed to. He had understood the way certain men understand that a young man with an idea could be defeated more efficiently by making the world around him refuse to sell him what he needed than by anything he might say to his face. Something in him wanted to break. He did not break. Something else in him, older and quieter, wanted to walk into the house, pack a bag, and leave for Ames in the morning. He sat with that for a long time. He let himself imagine it in full: the lecture halls, the library, the anonymity of being one student among thousands, the relief of no longer being the young man who had picked a fight he had no business picking. It would be a life. It would not be a small life. His teachers had been right about that. But when he closed his eyes, what he saw was not the campus at Ames. What he saw was his grandfather on the porch in the fall of 1957, one hand curled around the arm of the wicker chair, the other making a slow, small gesture in the air as he described what 40 years of pressure did to a piece of white oak. What he saw was his mother's back at the sink, not turning, saying 3 words that had cost her something to say in front of Wendell and Priscilla. What he saw most stubbornly was the burn pile, the way the outer boards of the silo had lain across it in a tangle before the match came, and the way Rick Thornton had waved his clipboard at it as if he were waving him toward the same fate. He opened his eyes. He stood up. He walked the length of the stack once more. He ran his hand down the flank of the densest stave in the pile, the one from the very bottom course of the silo, the one that had borne the weight of every crop for 4 decades, and had come out of the ordeal not weakened, but tempered. He said quietly to nobody in a voice barely above the sound of his own breath, "The problem with a man who calls a thing garbage is that he stops looking at it. And when he stops looking, he stops learning what it can do." He had not planned the sentence. It arrived from somewhere he did not know he had a room for. He stood with it for a moment, and it settled into his chest the way certain sentences do when they have named a thing correctly for the first time. Then he blew out the lamp and went back to the house. He slept badly. He woke before the light. He lay in bed listening to the wind moving in the cottonwoods along the ditch, and he thought about the 14 inches of excavation he was going to have to dig by hand because renting a small backhoe was money he no longer had, and he thought about his brother Corbin, whom he had already talked into 2 weekends of labor in exchange for fence work, and he wondered if 2 weekends would be enough for 2 people to move that much earth. And he began to be afraid for the first time in months that he had underestimated what he was about to do. He dressed in the dark. He went downstairs. He built up the fire in the stove. He stood at the sink with a cup of coffee he did not drink and watched the eastern sky begin to gray behind the cottonwoods. When he heard his father come down the stairs behind him, he did not turn around. He heard him pour his own coffee. He heard him take his coat off the hook by the door. He heard the small metallic sound of him opening the drawer of the sideboard, where he kept the things that had belonged to his own father. The pocket watch that no longer ran the folding knife with the yellowed bone handle, the framed photograph of his wedding day. He came up behind him at the sink. He did not put a hand on his shoulder. That was not his way. He set something down on the counter beside his coffee cup. Emmett looked at it. It was a folding wooden carpenter's rule, 6 feet long when extended, folded now into a compact stack of brass hinge sections the color of old butter. The wood was oiled hardwood darkened by 50 years of a man's hand. The brass hinges had been polished by use to a soft, dull gold. Every number along its length had been hand-lettered in the shop of a rule maker in Rockford, Illinois in 1908. His grandfather's rule, the one he had used to build the silo. Anders Halverson's voice when it came was as low as the wind in the cottonwoods and carried the same slow weight. He would have been proud of you. He would have said you were the one who was listening. He picked up the rule. His hand did not shake. He unfolded one section and refolded it, feeling the small, precise resistance of hinges that had opened and closed 100,000 times in the hand of a man he had loved and lost. Something in his throat closed and did not reopen for several seconds. When he spoke, it was not to his father. It was to the window, to the cottonwoods, to the gray line of the coming morning over the eastern fields, where 247 salvaged staves waited in the shed for the work he was about to begin. Then I'd better not waste it. He set the rule in the pocket of the canvas coat. He finished the coffee he had not been drinking. He went out through the porch door into the March air, and the door swung shut behind him with the small, definite sound of a young man who had considered his alternatives and chosen once and for all the harder road. The first weekend of the pour arrived on a Saturday morning in the last week of April, with the ground finally soft enough to break, and the wind coming down out of the northwest at a temperature that made Emmett glad he had waited. Corbin arrived at the site by 7 wearing his father's second pair of work boots, because his own had split at the sole the week before carrying a thermos of coffee his mother had pressed into his hands at the porch door with the instruction to make his brother drink some of it before he got started. He set the thermos on a flat rock at the edge of the excavation. He looked at the trench his brother had already begun to dig alone in the pre-dawn hours, and his face went through the slow rearrangement of a 16-year-old boy who has just understood that his weekend was going to be harder than his brother had let on. The excavation was 22 feet by 18, 14 inches deep across the entire footprint. Emmett had staked the corners the previous evening with lengths of oak lath and strung mason's line between them, so the outline of what would become his home lay across the low ground like a rectangle drawn in white thread. Inside that rectangle he had already moved, perhaps a quarter of the earth he needed to move working since 4 in the morning by lantern light, and his back was already telling him something he did not want to hear. Corbin picked up the second spade without a word. He set to work at the corner opposite his brother's, and for the first 2 hours they dug in silence. The only sounds the bite of steel into cold clay, the small ring of the shovel edges catching stones, the wind moving in the cottonwoods. When they stopped for water at 9, Corbin looked at what they had done and looked at what remained, and his voice came out lower than usual without the 16-year-old edge in it. "Emmett, this is a lot." He wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist. His voice was even. "It's a lot in the morning. It's less by supper. That's the only trick there is." By noon their mother came across the field from the farmhouse with a covered basket. She had brought thick slices of ham on buttered bread, 2 boiled eggs each, a small jar of pickled beets, and a pint of milk still cool from the cellar. She set the basket down on the flat rock. She looked into the trench without commenting on the progress. She had not come to inspect. She had come to feed her boys the way she had fed them since they were small enough to fit in the crook of her arm, and there was a specific kindness in her refusal to make a fuss over what her son was doing. Emmett understood the gift of it. He ate the ham without tasting it. He drank the milk. He got back into the trench. They finished the excavation late Sunday afternoon. Corbin was moving slowly by then, favoring his right shoulder where a spade handle had bruised him during a slip on Saturday evening. Emmett's palms had split open on both hands under the layers of tape he had wrapped around them, and the skin under the tape was the color of raw hamburger. Neither of them mentioned it. Corbin went home to soak his hands in Epsom salts. Emmett stayed at the site until dark, walking the perimeter with a level checking the depth at 3-foot intervals. With a stick he had notched to 14 inches, correcting the 2 spots where he had gone shallow. When he finally walked back across the field to the farmhouse, his mother had a kettle of hot water waiting on the stove, and did not ask him how the work had gone, only handed him a clean towel and pointed at the wash basin. The gravel came the next week. He hauled it himself from the drainage ditch bank load by load with the tractor and the small utility wagon his father had built in 1949. 8 inches deep across the whole footprint, tamped down with a hand tamper, he had welded together in the shed from a length of pipe and a flat steel plate. Each pass with the tamper drove the stones tighter against each other until the base underfoot rang differently when he stepped on it. A firmer sound, the sound of ground that would not settle unevenly under a slab. His grandfather had used a phrase for this. He had called it teaching the ground its manners. He thought of the phrase every time he brought the tamper down. The first section pour happened on a Saturday in the second week of May. He had chosen a section pour method rather than a single pour because he did not have a mixer that could handle the volume, and because he wanted the freedom to correct any early mistake before it became embedded across the entire slab. He had marked the slab into 4 sections, roughly 4 feet wide, running the full 18-foot depth. He would pour 1 section per weekend, letting each cure before the next. Corbin worked the mixer. His job was to load 2 shovels of gravel, 1 shovel of sand, 1 sack of Portland cement in halves, and enough water from the ditch to bring the mix to the consistency his brother called for. He learned by the 3rd batch to watch his hands rather than his face. When he held up 2 fingers, that meant more gravel. 3 fingers, more water. A flat palm hold and dump. He trusted him with the machine because he had grown up on machines and did not panic when a belt slipped or an engine coughed. Emmett worked the pour. He wheeled each load from the mixer to the form in his father's garden cart, balanced on a plank he had laid across the excavation edge, and he poured and spread and screeded off the top with a long straight board he had planned by hand the previous week to a perfectly flat edge. The board had come from an old barn joist, dense old-growth pine, the kind that no longer arrived at the yard in Eldora because the trees it had come from had been gone for 2 generations. He worked in a rhythm he had planned in his head over the winter. Load wheel pour spread screed. Load wheel pour spread screed. By 11 in the morning the first section was down. By 1 it had started to set. He covered it with damp burlap sacks weighted at the edges with bricks so it would cure slowly, so it would not lose water to the sun, and crack the way a fast-cured slab always cracked. His father came over on the second Saturday afternoon. He stood at the edge of the excavation for perhaps 20 minutes. He did not speak to Corbin at the mixer. He did not speak to Emmett at the screed. He watched. His arms were crossed. His face gave nothing to read. Then he walked back toward the north field where he was working the disc, and he did not come back until after dark. And even then he did not say anything about what he had seen. Emmett understood what the visit had been. It had been an inspection. He also understood that his father had not stayed longer because he had not needed to. He had seen enough in 20 minutes to know that his son was not playing at concrete. He was pouring it. By the third weekend, the two of them had rhythm. Corbin no longer needed him to signal with fingers. He watched the mix and adjusted before his brother asked. Their mother brought sandwiches at noon and did not stay to chat. On the Sunday of that third week, Emmett did something he had been rehearsing in his mind since the winter, which was the stave installation into the still green concrete of the final section. This was the part of the plan that could not be undone if it went wrong. This was the part that would either prove him right or turn the entire slab into a monument to his own overconfidence. He had sorted the staves the previous week. 98 of them, chosen from the densest lower third pieces, laid out in the shed floor in the exact alternating pattern he was going to install. He had walked among them a dozen times, adjusting the order, ensuring that no two staves of similar curvature sat side by side, ensuring that the joints between courses fell in a staggered brick pattern that would distribute load rather than concentrate it. When he had walked past the pile for the last time on Saturday night, he had done so without touching any of them. The following morning, Monday, he walked across the finished floor barefoot at 6 o'clock the way he had promised himself he would. He had wanted to feel it against his skin the first time, so he would know for himself without instruments whether it was true. It was cool underfoot from the concrete beneath. It was dense in a way no new lumber ever felt. When he pressed his weight down on a single stave, it did not move. When he jumped once in the middle of the room, the whole floor accepted his weight with the finality of a thing that had been assembled correctly. He stood in the center of what would become his house, and something like his grandfather's voice, though. Of course, it was only his own memory playing back at him, arrived from a great distance. The wood already did its work. You're just giving it a new job. The house rose over the summer. He framed the walls in the second week of May using dimensional lumber. He had traded 2 weeks of custom combining work with a farmer in Grundy County who was converting his dairy barn and had no use for the old floor joists. He salvaged siding from 2 derelict outbuildings on neighboring farms whose owners were glad to have the ruins gone. He bought a load of used brick from a decommissioned grain elevator in Radcliffe for $15 more brick than he needed by half, and he stacked the excess along the north wall of the machine shed against a day he could not yet imagine. He found 3 used windows at a farm sale down in Grundy County, still in their frames with their original panes intact for $4 each. He hung the doors in October. He insulated with sawdust packed between the studs and covered with tar paper, the same method his grandfather had used in 1912 when he built his first hog house, and which had proved itself over 50 winters in Iowa cold. By the second week of December in 1962, the house stood tight and finished on its stave floor, 22 by 18, with a sleeping loft above and a small square porch on the south face that caught the noon light. His total spending on materials came to $214. He moved in on the 2nd of January 1963. He was still 19 years old, but only for another 4 days. Rick Thornton had driven past the property twice during the fall. The first time was in early October when the roof was going on. He had slowed his truck on the county road, taken a long look at the frame structure, and continued on without stopping. The second time was in November, when the doors had been hung and smoke was rising for the first time from the small brick chimney Emmett had built with his own hands from the Radcliffe brick. He had slowed again. He had not stopped. What he told his wife that evening at the supper table, if he told her anything, went unrecorded. What he told the men at the co-op counter in Ackley the following Wednesday, however, did not. Thornton had waited a decent interval after the roof went on before he began the second phase of his campaign. He had understood correctly that the visible completion of the exterior of the house would generate a certain amount of talk in the county, and that the talk would not go the way he wanted unless he shaped it. His method was the same as before. He arrived at the co-op counter on a Wednesday morning in late November, ordered his coffee, opened his newspaper, and waited for the conversation around him to touch on the topic he required. When one of the older farmers mentioned in the general way, old farmers mention such things, that the Halverson boy seemed to have gotten his house up. Thornton nodded slowly and set his coffee cup down and spoke as if to himself, though his voice carried to every corner of the room. His words were careful. He got the walls up, I'll give him that. The question isn't the walls. The question is, what happens under that slab this January when the frost gets serious? Old wood embedded in green concrete on drainage ground. I've seen contractors with 15 years of experience make that same mistake. It's going to come apart at the joints by March. And when it does, Anders is going to be looking at a liability problem because that boy's living out there on his own, and it's his father's name on the deed. And if anybody gets hurt, walking on a floor that separates from the slab underneath. He let the sentence end there. He picked up his coffee. He turned a page of the newspaper. He had not accused him of anything. He had not predicted his failure directly. He had only, in the way of certain men, hung a doubt in the air and left it to gather weight over the coming weeks. The doubt reached the Halverson farmhouse through Corbin. He came home from a Saturday morning at the feed store in early December with his face red from more than the cold. He set his coat on the hook by the door. He did not take his boots off. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking at his brother, who was sitting at the table with the December bulletins from the extension service, and his voice came out lower than he had probably intended. Emmett, Thornton's telling people the floor is going to split apart in January. He's saying Dad's going to be sued if somebody falls. Emmett did not look up from the bulletin. His voice, when it came, had a stillness in it that surprised his brother. How many people did you hear it from? 3, 2 at the store, 1 on the road driving out. Everybody's heard it. He turned a page. He read 1 full paragraph of the bulletin before he spoke again, because he had learned that if he spoke while his hands wanted to shake, his voice would give him away. When he was ready, his tone was as flat as the tabletop. The floor is fine. The floor is going to be fine in January. It's going to be fine in every January. I know it is, but that's not the point. The point is, he's making Dad look bad. He's making you look... Corbin, stop. He looked up at him. His eyes were the color of the November sky outside the window. His voice went quiet enough that his brother had to lean forward to catch it. A man like Rick Thornton is not going to be stopped by me arguing with him at the co-op counter. He is going to be stopped by that floor still being flat in 1970. That is the only argument that is going to work. Every other argument makes him bigger. So I am going to let the floor speak for itself. And I am going to ask you, please, to let me handle this in my own way. Corbin looked at him for a long moment. He was 16. He did not fully understand what he meant. But he had grown up watching his brother, and he had learned by then that his stillness was not the same thing as passivity. It was a specific kind of patience that his father also had, that his grandfather had had before them, and that he himself was still learning how to develop. He nodded once. He took off his boots. He did not raise the subject again. But that night, alone in the house he had built with his own hands on the floor. He had laid with his own hands. Emmett sat at his kitchen table with the kerosene lamp burning low and let himself sit with what Thornton had done. Not the laugh. The laugh he had absorbed months ago. What he could not so easily absorb was the sustained, patient, deliberate character of his effort against him. He had not tired of him. He had not moved on. He had made him for reasons he was still working out into a project of his own, a thing he needed to defeat in order to feel correct about his own initial dismissal of him. The realization arrived in his chest with the weight of a small stone. It did not crush him. It settled. His mother came across the field a little after 9 that night. Emmett heard the tap on the door and rose to open it. Marta Halverson had walked over in her heavy coat with a covered enamel cup of coffee in each hand. She stepped inside without ceremony, set the 2 cups on the table, and looked around the small, tight room with the expression of a woman who was seeing her son's home for perhaps the 3rd time and was still working out how to feel about it. She sat down. She pushed one of the cups toward him. She wrapped her own hands around the other. Her voice, when it came, was pitched low, the way she had spoken to her children when they were small and needed something more than an ordinary tone. Corbin told me what he told you. Emmett nodded. He did not pick up the cup. Marta looked at him for a long moment. She had a way of looking at a person that was not searching, exactly, more like measuring the way a seamstress measures a length of cloth against a pattern. When she was done, she reached across the table and put her hand briefly over his, and then she withdrew it because they were not a family of long touches. Her voice went low again. Emmett, I want you to hear something from me because it is the only thing I have to give you tonight, and I would rather give it to you now than have you find it out the hard way. You did not do this for them. You did not do this to prove Rick Thornton wrong. You did this because it was right and because your grandfather taught you how and because you are your father's son. Whatever they say about you at the co-op does not touch what you built. It cannot reach it. The floor is under your feet. It is not under theirs. Do you understand me? Emmett understood. He reached for the coffee cup. His hands did not shake. The two of them sat in silence for perhaps 10 minutes, drinking, listening to the wind in the cottonwoods on the far side of the ditch, and then Marta stood up, laid her palm briefly against the crown of his head, with the same quick habit she had used since he was 4, and went back out into the December cold without another word. Emmett slept through the night for the first time in a week. The winter passed. The temperature in Hardin County that January reached 27 degrees below zero on the night of the 18th, which was the coldest reading in the county in a decade. Emmett banked his fire and slept in wool socks and heard the frame of his house creak once in the deepest part of the cold, the small settling sound of a building accepting a season. The floor beneath him did not move. The floor did not crack. When he woke on the morning of the 19th and walked into the main room in his bare feet, the cold from the concrete beneath the staves rose through the wood into his soles, but the wood itself lay flat and true and gave nothing back to the freeze but silence. He stood in the middle of the room in the pale dawn light. He said aloud to nobody in a voice that came out steadier than he had expected, "Let him try to argue with that." He said it once. He did not say it again. He got dressed and went out to feed the chickens. The spring of 1963 arrived with the ground softening and the red-winged blackbirds returning to the drainage ditch and the annual workday gathering at his father's farm falling on the second Saturday of April. This was the tradition of the county. 15 or 20 men would come to help a neighbor with a large task, and they would stay for a meal afterward, and the wives would talk in the kitchen while the men talked in the yard, and the whole thing would resemble something between a barn raising and a family reunion. That year, the task at the Halverson place was the cleaning and reorganizing of the main machine shed for the coming season. It took most of the day. By 4 in the afternoon, the work was done, and Anders Halverson did what he had discussed with his wife the night before, which was to invite the entire crew across the yard and down the lane to see his son's house. Emmett had known this was coming. He had scrubbed the floor of his main room on Friday night with a soft cloth and a small amount of lemon oil, so the surface would show its depth without shining artificially. I had made a pot of coffee that would stretch to 15 cups, and Marta had brought over 2 pies from the farmhouse, and there was nothing else to do but open the door and stand aside. The men came up the lane in a loose group, laughing tired coats open in the mild April afternoon. Merle Gustafson was among them. Gustafson was 58 years old, tall, thin, weathered, a Norwegian-descended farmer of 400 acres north of Ackley, who had built his own house in 1951 with his own hands and had a specific interest in construction that most of the other men did not share. He entered the small front room with his cap in his hand, and he took 2 steps across the threshold, and he stopped so abruptly that the man behind him nearly walked into his back. Gustafson looked down at the floor beneath his boots. He did not speak for perhaps 10 full seconds. The room began to fill up behind him, men crowding in past his shoulders, the conversation dropping in volume as more of them noticed what he was looking at. Gustafson finally crouched down on his heels. He set his cap on the floor beside him. He ran the flat of his right hand across the surface of the wood in a slow arc, feeling the grain, the density, the small, tight interlocking of the curves. His voice, when it came, was quiet enough that only the men in the front of the group heard him clearly. His words landed in the room like a dropped tool. "Where did you get this flooring?" Emmett was standing near the stove with his hands folded. He met his eye. His voice was even, "The old silo, my grandfather's silo, the one that came down last March." Gustafson looked at him. He looked back down at the floor. He pressed his thumbnail hard against the surface of the stave beneath his hand. Nothing happened. He pressed harder. His thumbnail slid off without leaving a mark. His voice went even quieter than it had been. "These are silo staves." "Yes." He stood up slowly. He turned to face the room. Every man behind him had gone still. Gustafson had a certain standing in the county that did not need to be announced. When he stopped and looked at a thing, other men looked at the same thing, and when he pronounced upon it, other men listened. He did not pronounce yet. He walked the length of the floor from the front door to the stove. He crouched again at the far end. He tapped the surface with his knuckles, listening for a hollow. He got no hollow. He rose again. He came back across the floor to where Emmett was standing. His voice was for him alone, though the whole room could hear him. "My silo is coming down this fall. I was going to burn the staves. I would like to talk to you before I do." Emmett kept his hands folded. He kept his face still. Something in his chest was doing a thing it had not done since his grandfather had died. He did not let it show. His voice, when it came, was level. "I'd be glad to talk with you, Mr. Gustafson, any time you like." The men behind him began slowly at first to move around the room. They crouched. They tapped. They ran their hands along the wood. Two of them exchanged a look Emmett did not fully catch. One of them, a farmer named Enos Krogh from the western part of the county, straightened up and looked at his father with an expression Anders Halverson had not seen on a neighbor's face in perhaps 20 years. It was the expression of a man who had walked into a room expecting one thing and had found another, and who had not yet decided what to do with the discovery. Rick Thornton was not in that room. He had not been invited to the workday. His name did not come up while the men were drinking coffee and eating pie. But something happened in that room during those 40 minutes that could not be undone by any amount of subsequent conversation at the co-op counter. 15 men had put their hands on Emmett Halverson's floor. 15 men had confirmed with their own bodies that the wood was harder than any lumber they had used in the past 10 years. 15 men would go home to their wives that evening and mention in the offhand way men mentioned such things, that the Halverson boy had built something worth looking at. The rumor Rick Thornton had planted in November did not die that afternoon. Rumors of that kind rarely die outright. But it began from that Saturday forward to lose its footing. And Rick Thornton, who did not have a spy at the Halverson workday, but who had ways of hearing what men were saying in the county, learned within the week that his campaign had lost ground. His response when it came was to escalate. He did not come to Emmett. He went to his father. He arranged through a mutual acquaintance at the county board to run into Anders at the Ackley Co-op on a Wednesday morning in late April, and he approached him at the counter with the easy manner of a professional greeting a peer. He inquired about the spring planting. He asked after Wendell and Priscilla. Then, in the manner of a man who has just remembered something, he lowered his voice and delivered the sentence he had rehearsed on the drive over. His voice was the voice of a man doing another man a favor. "Anders, I want to talk to you about your boy. There's talk going around, and I know you know that, and I want you to understand that I have not been the one starting it. But I am concerned. He's a bright young man. I said that from the beginning. What I'm hearing, though, is that he's not entirely stable in his thinking. Living alone out there at 19, refusing offers of help, arguing with the county agent holed up in a shed by himself for weeks on end, talking to old lumber. I've heard things from people who have talked to him that make me wonder whether he oughtn't to be seeing somebody. A doctor. Something. I say this only because I have known your family for 15 years, and I would hate to see this go somewhere unfortunate." Anders Halverson had been leaning against the counter with his elbow on his newspaper. He did not straighten up. He did not look at Rick Thornton. He looked past him at the far wall where a calendar advertising John Deere hung on a nail beside a printed notice about a livestock auction the following week. I waited a full 10 seconds before he answered. When he did, his voice was so low that the two men standing 4 feet away at the coffee urn did not hear a word of it. Rick Thornton heard every syllable. Anders's words came out one at a time, spaced like fence posts. "Rick, my son is the most stable person in this county. If you ever in any conversation with any human being suggest otherwise again, I will hear about it before the day is out. And when I do, we will have a different kind of conversation. I want you to think very carefully about whether you understood what I just said." Rick Thornton had expected many things from Anders Halverson. He had not expected that. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He nodded once. He picked up his coffee. He walked out of the co-op without buying his newspaper. Anders Halverson did not tell his son about the exchange. He did not tell his wife. He put on his hat. He drove home. He worked his fields for the rest of the day, the way he worked them every day, without complaint, without comment. And when he came in for supper that evening, he ate his wife's roast beef in silence, and he went to bed at 9, and if any of it had cost him anything, he did not show it. But something had shifted in him that morning that would not shift back, and Emmett would come to feel the difference in him over the coming months without ever knowing why. The Gustafson job came together in the fall. Gustafson's silo came down in the first week of October, and he called Emmett the same day. He drove his father's flatbed the 18 miles up to Ackley, with Corbin along to help load. Gustafson's staves came from an 18-inch diameter silo, larger than his grandfather's, with 312 sound staves waiting when they arrived. Gustafson stood in the yard with his hands in his pockets, while Emmett walked the pile with his penetrometer sorting as he went, marking the densest with a lumber crayon. He watched him work for 20 minutes before he spoke. His voice was thoughtful. "You have a system." He did not look up from the stave he was testing. "My grandfather had one. I've been refining it." "You want to floor my new dairy barn." Now he looked up. He stood slowly. He wiped his hands on his canvas coat. His voice, when it came, was careful. "Mr. Gustafson, a barn floor is different from a house floor. Cattle traffic, manure, loading, tractor scrape. I would need to know your dimensions and your subgrade before I could tell you honestly whether the method would hold. That's why I want you. Every other contractor in this county would tell me it would hold and then send me the bill. You just told me you don't know yet. That's what I'm buying." He stood with that for a moment. Then he nodded once. He named a price of $40 for the labor materials from Gustafson's own silo, and Gustafson agreed on the spot with the small smile of a man who suspects he is being undercharged and does not care to correct the person doing it. The barn was 60 feet by 30. The floor Emmett laid in his central feed alley in the spring of 1964 was 240 square feet of alternating staves bonded to a fresh concrete pour, finished with a light oil for grip. Gustafson walked the length of it the day he finished. He stamped his boot heel against it in 3 places. His voice was flat. "That'll do." It did more than do. It held through daily tractor traffic. It held through the scrape of a manure spreader twice a day. It held through the freeze-thaw cycling of 4 winters without a single crack, which was something plain concrete in that barn had never managed. By the spring of 1965, 4 other farmers in the county had come to look at Gustafson's barn floor, and 2 of them had asked Emmett about installations of their own. Rick Thornton's business during the same period continued to run. He kept his 2 crews busy. He bid competitively. He was not driven out. But something in the man had changed subtly in a way that would only become clear later. He no longer went to the co-op on Wednesdays. He no longer stopped in at the Ackley hardware store to trade small talk with Ralston. When he did work in the northern part of the county, he arrived early and left early and did not linger. Whether this was because of the exchange at the coffee counter with Anders Halverson, or because he had begun to hear other men mention Emmett's work in tones he did not enjoy, was impossible to say from the outside. Both were true. Neither was the whole story. The whole story arrived in the summer of 1966, and it arrived through a farmer named Otto Sievert, who had made a mistake he did not yet know he had made. Otto Sievert farmed 280 acres in the eastern part of Hardin County. He was 46 years old, second-generation German-American, careful with a dollar in the specific way his father had taught him. I had been planning to put up a new machine shed 60 by 40 for 2 years. He had needed to time the build around a good harvest year and a favorable interest rate at the bank, and both had aligned in 1966. He had asked around for slab bids in April. He had received 3. Rick Thornton's had been the lowest by $180. Sievert had accepted the bid on price. His wife had asked him at the kitchen table the night he signed the papers whether he had heard the rumor that Thornton had been cutting corners on foundation work in Grundy County. Sievert had waved the question away. Grundy County was Grundy County. Hardin County was where a man's reputation lived, and Thornton had operated in Hardin County for 15 years without a scandal. Sievert had told himself this was a settled matter. It was not. The pour happened in June. Thornton's crew was in and out in a day and a half. The slab looked good when they left. By the second week of July, it did not. The first crack appeared as a diagonal line running from the northwest corner toward the center of the slab. Sievert noticed it on a Sunday morning after church. He crouched down over it with his coffee cup. He measured the width with the edge of his thumbnail. It was hairline, but it ran 14 feet, and by the following Wednesday, a second crack had appeared running parallel to the first from the southeast corner, and by the last Sunday of the month, a third had opened from the north edge and joined the first 2 at a rough triangle near the center of the slab. Sievert called Thornton on a Monday. Thornton came out on a Tuesday. He walked the slab. He crouched at the cracks with the expression of a man performing a diagnosis. He stood up. He looked at Sievert with the calm authority of a professional soothing a nervous client. His voice was practiced. Otto, what you're seeing is settlement cracking. It's normal on agricultural slabs. The width you're looking at here is within tolerance. This slab is going to serve you for 30 years. You just have to accept that concrete is a living material. It moves. It cracks in patterns. This is what it does. Sievert was not fully persuaded. His wife had accompanied him out to the slab that morning. She was standing near the pickup with her arms crossed. She had said nothing during Thornton's speech, but her face had told her husband what she thought of it. Sievert asked in the careful tone of a man not looking for a fight, "Rick, this crack here has an offset. One side is higher than the other. That's not settlement cracking. That's differential settlement. Isn't it?" Thornton's face did something small. He recovered quickly. His voice was warmer, more indulgent, the voice of a professional handling a customer who has read one article too many. "Otto, every slab has some offset at the joints. 3/8 of an inch is within specification for a shed floor. If it gets to 1/2 an inch, we can talk about a repair. But we are not there yet. I would not lose sleep over this. Trust me on this. 15 years I've been pouring these." He drove off in his truck a few minutes later. Sievert stood at the edge of his cracked slab with his coffee cold in his hand, and his wife came up beside him, and her voice was low and had a specific weight in it. He had learned over 22 years of marriage to respect Otto. "Call the Halverson boy." Sievert did not answer immediately. He looked at the crack. He looked at the offset. He thought about a story he had heard at the elevator that spring, about a young man not much older than his own nephew who had built his own house on a silo stave floor, and had somehow, in the way small stories accumulate weight in a small county, become the person other men called when a slab had gone wrong. His voice when it came was as low as his wife's, "Give me till Friday." He gave himself till Friday. Friday came. He drove to the Halverson place. He did not park in the yard. He parked at the top of the lane and walked the last 100 yards on foot because he had not yet decided how he was going to phrase the question he needed to ask, and he needed the walking time to work it out. Emmett was in the machine shed when he arrived, sharpening a plane blade at the bench grinder. He heard the footsteps on the gravel and looked up. He did not know Otto Sievert well, but he knew his name and his face, and he understood within the space of 2 seconds, from the way he was standing in his shed doorway, with his hat in his hand, exactly why he had come. He turned off the grinder. He set the blade down on the bench. He wiped his hands on his canvas apron. He waited. Sievert's voice came out drier than he had wanted. "Mr. Halverson, I hired the wrong contractor for my slab. I have 3 cracks in it, and one of them has an offset. He tells me it's within tolerance. My wife tells me it isn't. I'd like to bring you out there. I'd like your honest opinion. I will pay for your time whether or not you agree to do any work." Emmett looked at him for a long moment. His voice when it came was quiet and clear and carried without his intending it something of his mother's schoolteacher patience. "Mr. Sievert, save your money. I'll come look at it Tuesday morning. If it's what you think it is, we'll talk about what to do next. If it's what he says it is, I'll tell you that too, and I won't charge you either way." Sievert nodded. He set his hat back on his head. He turned to go. At the door of the shed he paused. He looked back over his shoulder. His voice had a note in it he had not intended to let him hear. His words came out low. "My wife said something to me on Sunday I want to pass along. She said a man who is only sure of himself is not the same thing as a man who is right. She meant Thornton, but she also meant me. I've been telling myself he knew what he was doing because I wanted him to. I don't want to make that mistake twice." He walked back down the lane to his truck. He drove away. Emmett stood in the shed doorway with the plane blade in one hand, watching the dust settle behind his tailgate, and he understood in the slow gathering way. Understanding sometimes arrives that something in the county had just moved. Not enough to see, not enough to name. But he had been the one to whom Otto Sievert had walked, and not Rick Thornton, and the walking had been done by a man whose wife had spoken the sentence he needed to hear. That evening, at the last light, he walked out to the front of his own house. He stood at the edge of the porch. He looked back across the field toward his father's farmhouse, where the kitchen window was already lit, and his mother was already at the sink. He thought about the 4 years that had passed since a man had laughed at him by a burn pile. I thought about the coming Tuesday, the drive out to Sievert's place, the diagnosis he was going to have to deliver, the repair he was going to have to design. He thought about Rick Thornton, who did not yet know on this warm evening in the last week of July of 1966 that a farmer in the eastern part of the county had just made a telephone call that was going to travel farther than any of his own careful whispered campaigns had ever traveled. He did not yet know that a young man whose stability he had once questioned was about to be summoned by name to correct the failure of his own work. He did not yet know that the season he had spent 4 years preparing for was about to begin. He stood on the porch until the last of the light was gone. Then he went inside and closed the door. Tuesday morning arrived with a heat already climbing by 7, the kind of August-adjacent July heat that made the corn stand still and the cicadas start before breakfast. Emmett drove east across the county in his father's Ford pickup with a canvas satchel on the seat beside him, containing a hammer, a 2-foot level, a small folding rule, the penetrometer he had built the previous year, a spool of mason's line, and a pad of yellow paper. He wore work trousers, a chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and the same canvas coat he had worn on the day the silo came down, though the coat rode now on the seat beside him because the morning was already too warm for it. Otto Sievert was waiting in his yard when he pulled in. His wife stood on the porch of the farmhouse drying her hands on a kitchen towel, watching without pretending not to. Sievert lifted a hand in greeting. He did not walk toward Emmett. He waited for him to come to him. He recognized the gesture as one of respect and did not comment on it. He stepped down from the truck, shouldered the satchel, and followed him across the yard toward the shed slab. The slab lay open to the sun. It was a full 60 by 40 rectangle, still bare of framing the perimeter forms, long since stripped, and the surface finished with a fair steel trowel that Thornton's crew had at least done competently. From 20 feet away it looked whole. From 10 feet away, the first crack became visible, a hairline running southeast to northwest across the western third. From 5 feet the second crack appeared, and beyond it the third and the offset he had been called out to diagnose lay at the intersection near the geometric center. A small, deliberate step in the concrete, perhaps 3/8 of an inch tall, running for 11 feet before it faded back into the flat. Emmett crouched. He set the satchel on the concrete beside him. He did not speak for the first 8 minutes. He measured the width of each crack at 3 points along its length. He noted each measurement on the yellow pad in a small, careful hand. He pressed his palm flat against the concrete on either side of the offset and felt the differential, the small, unmistakable vertical step of a slab that had separated from itself. He tapped the concrete with the flat of his hammer along a grid pattern he was working out in his head, listening for the change in tone that would tell him where the void was. Sievert stood 10 feet back with his hands in his pockets. He did not interrupt. His wife had come down off the porch and joined him at the 20-foot mark. Neither spoke. Emmett straightened after 20 minutes. He dusted his palms on his thighs. He walked the perimeter of the slab once, then walked a diagonal from the southwest corner to the northeast, tapping every 3 feet as he went. When he was done, he came back to where the Sieverts were standing, and he spoke without preamble in the same measured tone he used when he was working through a problem in his own head and needed to hear it aloud. His words came slow. The 2 hairline cracks on the west side are surface tension cracks from a fast set. Your contractor poured on a hot afternoon and did not shade the slab. Those 2 will not open further. You can fill them with epoxy or leave them alone. Either way, they are cosmetic. The offset is a different animal. That is differential settlement caused by inadequate gravel base under the eastern third. The subgrade there is clay, and there is less than 6 inches of gravel above it. Freeze cycling will open that offset another 1/4 inch every winter for the next 5 to 8 years until the slab either has to come out or has to be structurally overlaid. You have 2 options. You can cut and re-pour the affected section, which will cost you about $400, and give you a slab that still has a joint in it. Or you can overlay the entire surface with a staved layer bonded to the existing concrete, which will cost you about $240 in materials. Will bridge the offset, will resist the fertilizer and fuel spills you are going to have in this shed for the next 30 years, and will outlast the concrete underneath it. Sievert stood with his jaw slightly set. His wife had lowered her arms from where they had been crossed. Sievert did not need to ask which option he was recommending. He had not recommended one. He had laid out the facts and left the choice to him, which was, he understood in the moment, the exact reason his wife had told him to make the call. His voice was flat. How did you know the gravel was less than 6 inches without digging? Emmett looked at him. His voice was flatter. The crack pattern, Straight-line offsets on clay subgrade almost always trace back to a base under 6 inches. I have seen it 4 times in the last 2 years. On slabs he poured. On slabs. I did not name a contractor. Sievert nodded slowly. He looked at the offset. He looked at his wife. He looked at the shed frame he had already lumbered up and stacked against the north side of the yard, waiting for a slab that would hold it. His voice, when it came, had a weight in it that surprised him. Do the overlay. Start when you can. He started this following Monday. He brought Corbin. He brought Merle Gustafson, who had asked without being asked whether he might come along and help for a day, because he had heard about the job and wanted to see how the overlay method worked on a slab that had already failed. Gustafson lifted staves. He mixed slurry. He said very little. He watched Emmett work with the same measuring expression his wife wore at the sink. When the day was done and he had washed up at the pump in Sievert's yard and was about to leave, he stood by the door of his truck with his cap in his hand, and he said something to Sievert that Sievert would later repeat at the elevator without adding a single word of embellishment. Gustafson's words were low. Otto, that boy is going to change how buildings get put up in this county. You mark it. In 10 years, there will be men driving down from Waterloo to ask him how he did it. And he will still be charging you what he thinks the work is worth, not what he could get. Sievert marked it. He also, without being asked, told the story at the elevator the following Wednesday. He told it plainly without the polish. Some men give a story they want to make theirs. He said Rick Thornton had told him the offset was within tolerance. He said the Halverson boy had walked the slab for 20 minutes and told him the base was under 6 inches without touching a shovel. He said he was right. He said Thornton had left him with a failing slab and a bill he had already paid. He said what came next was going to be a story worth watching. 3 of the men at the counter that morning had been present for a Wednesday in November of 1962 when Rick Thornton had planted a rumor about a 19-year-old in a floor. The following Saturday, she had driven the 12 miles up to the Halverson place herself in a Chevy her father had given her when she started teaching, and she had knocked on the door of the small, tight house Emmett had built with his own hands. When he opened it, she had said before he could speak, "My name is Clara Bergstrom. I saw your floor at the Gustafson barn last week. I want to ask you one question, and then I will leave. And if you never want to see me again, I will understand. Did you build that floor yourself?" "Yes." "The pour, too?" "Yes." She had stood with that for a moment. She had nodded once. She had asked whether he would consider allowing her to come by the following Sunday afternoon so they might sit on the porch and talk about wood. He had agreed. She had come. They had talked about wood for 3 hours. She had come back the next Sunday and the next after that. She had never once in any conversation between them offered him advice about a floor he had already laid or suggested he should have done a thing differently, or said the sentence he had heard from every other person in the county who had encountered his work, which was that he should not be doing what he was doing without help. She had asked him instead at the end of their 4th Sunday whether he would like her help. He had answered that he would like her company. She had understood the distinction and had loved him for the clarity of it, and had told him so on the 5th Sunday, and he had asked her to marry him on the 7th. They were married in the small Methodist church in Eldora with fewer than 30 people present. Clara moved into the house Emmett had built. She kept teaching at the elementary in Ackley. She set up a small desk in the sleeping loft where she graded papers in the evenings by lamplight. She did not touch his floor. When people came by to see it, which they did with increasing frequency after the Sievert story spread, Clara would stand in the doorway with her hands folded and let her husband show them what he had built, and she would answer any questions about the school in Ackley that fell within her own knowledge, and she would refer every question about the floor to him, without exception, and she would say, when asked directly by a visitor whether she had helped him lay it, only this: "I met him 4 years after he finished. The floor is his. I am here because of it." Their son was born in September of 1967. They named him Anders after Emmett's father, who had by then earned the name back into the family for a second generation with a particular firmness that his own father would have recognized. The boy learned to walk in the winter of 1968 on the floor Emmett had laid at 19. His first steps were taken between the kitchen table and the wood stove, 3 unsteady lurches across a surface of alternating compressed white oak that was, by his father's private calculation, older than the country he was walking in. Between the fall of 1966 and the spring of 1971, Emmett laid stave floors in 11 separate buildings across Hardin County and the 2 counties adjacent to it. 4 machine sheds, 2 dairy barns, a hog confinement building near Steamboat Rock, a feed storage facility in Franklin County, 3 residential installations, 2 of them additions, and 1 a full house for a widow named Ida Rasmussen, who had watched the Sievert overlay go in and had decided she wanted her retirement kitchen floored the same way. Emmett laid every one of them alone, or with Clara assisting on the light work in the evenings after school let out. He varied his finishes based on application, hand-rubbed linseed for residential unsealed with grit broom finish for barns where cattle would slip on polished wood, a fine wax for the widow Rasmussen's kitchen. The core method never changed. Alternating orientation slurry bonds sorted by density, hand-finished at the end. He refined his tools. He built a second penetrometer with a finer spring and a graduated dial, so he could sort staves not just into 2 categories, but into 5. He began keeping a small ledger book, hand-ruled, in which he recorded each installation, the source of the staves, their position of origin in the parent silo, the density readings, the substrate condition, the slurry mix ratio, the ambient temperature, at the pour the moisture, reading of the concrete when the staves went in. He was, without knowing it or naming it as such, building the first systematic performance record of a construction method that had never before existed as a discipline. The ledger book would matter later. It did not matter yet. His stave inventory grew. Silos were coming down across northern Iowa at a steady rate throughout the late 60s as farmers converted to metal grain bins and concrete stave silos for silage. The wooden staves from the 1910s and 1920s were being burned by the truckload. Emmett had made it known through the network of conversations that functioned as communication in rural Iowa that he would come and haul staves from any silo demolition in the region at no cost to the owner. By the fall of 1969, he had accumulated enough sorted stave inventory in a rented pole shed just north of Ackley to floor approximately 4,000 square feet of installed surface, which was more than he expected to need in the near term, but which he held on to because he understood, as his grandfather had understood, that the supply was finite and would not be replenished. Rick Thornton during these same years watched his business begin to soften. The softening was not visible at first. He kept both crews busy through 1967 and 1968. He bid competitively on foundation work as far south as Grundy Center and as far north as Hampton, but he had lost without being able to fully name why a particular kind of job. The private residential slab, the custom agricultural building where the owner cared about the specifics. The higher margin work that came to a contractor by reputation rather than by lowest bid. Those jobs had begun sometime around late 1966 to go past him without stopping. He heard second and third hand that Emmett Halverson was doing more of the residential work in the northern part of the county than any other single contractor. He heard that he was being paid by the square foot at rates that surprised him when he did the math. He heard that Merle Gustafson had recommended him without prompting to a farmer in Hamilton County who had subsequently hired him for a barn overlay that Thornton himself had bid on and lost. He heard all of this from a distance. He did not go to the Halverson place. He did not seek him out. He continued to run his business the way he had always run it, and to a stranger driving past his yard in Iowa Falls, the operation would have looked identical to the operation of 5 years earlier. But something in him had shifted subtly in a way that would only become clear when the pressure became sufficient. He had begun without admitting it to himself to think about him, not as an antagonist, not exactly as a rival, more as a puzzle. He could not solve a demonstration, he could not refute a floor he had never walked on that had become a fact. He had to work around every day of his professional life. The Franklin County job broke him. Or rather, the Franklin County job did the specific work of forcing him to admit to himself what he had been avoiding for 4 years, which is a different kind of breaking and often the more useful kind. A large dairy operation south of Hampton had gone out to bid in February of 1971 on a new milking parlor. The specification package drafted by an architect out of Waterloo called for a bonded silo stave overlay in the parlor holding area with specific reference by name to the extension bulletin practice from Hardin County. Rick Thornton read the specification twice. He did not know how to price the overlay. He had never done one. He had never watched one done. He had access to the extension bulletin, but the bulletin described a method in general terms and did not include the density sorting protocol, the slurry mix specifics, or the timing that Emmett had refined over 11 installations and had not published anywhere. Thornton put in a bid based on his best estimate of materials and hours. He lost the bid by a wide margin. He learned through a conversation with the concrete supplier who worked with both operations that he had lost it to a young man working out of Hardin County who had priced the overlay at 40% below his figure and had guaranteed the work in writing. He drove home that evening in a silence his wife did not attempt to break. He sat at his own kitchen table with a cup of coffee he did not drink. He looked out the window at a yard he had improved, at a truck he had bought new the previous fall, at a life that had been on every visible measure of success. And he understood with the small, precise clarity that sometimes arrives when a man has finally stopped fighting a piece of information that he was going to have to do the thing he had spent 9 years avoiding. He drove to the Halverson place on a Wednesday morning in the first week of April of 1971. He arrived at 9. He did not turn into the drive at first. He continued past the mailbox, drove another quarter-mile down the county road, turned around in a field access, and came back. He turned in. He parked in the yard next to the machine shed. He sat in his truck for perhaps 4 full minutes before he opened the door. Emmett was in the shed. He was sharpening a plane blade at the bench grinder, the same bench where he had been standing when Otto Sievert had come to him almost 5 years earlier. He heard the truck door slam. He heard boots on the gravel. He looked up as the shadow of a man crossed the doorway. Rick Thornton stepped into the shed. His eyes took a moment to adjust from the April light. When they did, he looked around and Emmett watched him look, and he watched him take in what his shed had become. The rows of sorted staves along the north wall, labeled by density class with hand-painted stencils he had made from tin can lids. The tool wall with its planes and draw knives, and the 2 hand-built penetrometers hanging from cup hooks. The ledger book open on the workbench beside a coffee cup. The workshop of a person who had, in the years since he had last seen him, become something he did not have a word for. Thornton looked at him. He turned off the grinder. He did not step forward. He did not put down the plane blade. He waited. Thornton's voice, when it came, was flat with a specific effort at directness that a man of his kind found expensive to produce. I lost the Franklin County parlor to you. I need to know how you do the overlay method. I am prepared to pay for the instruction. Emmett looked at him. He set the plane blade down on the bench. He looked at him for a long moment, and something in his chest did a small, careful weighing. I thought about the day at the burn pile. He thought about the November afternoon his 16-year-old brother had come home red-faced from the co-op with word of what Thornton was telling the county. He thought about Vernon Kyle refusing his cement order. He thought about his father's face the day he had come home from the coffee counter in April of 1963 and had eaten his supper in silence. His voice, when it came, was as level as the tabletop he was standing beside. You told me they were garbage. You told me that in front of your entire crew. Thornton's jaw set. He did not look away. His voice came out quieter than he had expected and lower, and it was the quietest and lowest thing he had ever heard him say. I know what I said. He held his gaze. He let the silence stretch. He had earned the right to let it stretch, and he was not going to give the moment up any sooner than he needed to. When he spoke again, it was not with anger. Anger was for people who had not yet been vindicated. What he felt was closer to a specific kind of tiredness, the tiredness of a person who has been carrying a stone for 9 years and is trying to decide whether to set it down. His words came slow. The problem with a man who calls something garbage is that he stops looking at it, and when he stops looking, he stops learning what it might do. You have been in the construction business for 20 years, Mr. Thornton. I have been in it for 9. I have learned things in 9 years that you have not learned in 20 because I was willing to look at a piece of wood that you were willing to burn. That is not a virtue on my part. That is simply what happens when a person is not too proud to see what is in front of him. Thornton did not answer. He stood in the middle of the shed with his cap in his hand, and something in his shoulders had come down a small, measurable distance from where it had been when he walked in. Emmett picked up the plane blade. He turned it in his fingers. He looked back at him. His voice was quieter now, the anger gone out of it, replaced by something practical. Come back Saturday morning, 8 o'clock. Bring a notebook and a pencil. I will show you the full method. I will not give you the short version. I will show you how to sort. I will show you the slurry ratio. I will show you the pour timing. I will show you what goes wrong when you skip any of the steps. It will take about 4 hours. When it is done, you will owe me nothing. I do not want your money. What I want is that when a client of yours asks where you learned it, you tell them the truth. That is my price. Thornton nodded once. His voice was low. Saturday, 8 o'clock. I will be here. He set his cap on his head. He walked out of the shed. He got into his truck. He drove down the lane without looking back. He came back Saturday at 7:45. He waited in his truck until 8 sharp. He came into the shed with a spiral notebook and 2 pencils, one behind each ear. He said good morning. Emmett said good morning. He poured him a cup of coffee from his thermos. He began the instruction. He took him through the entire method for 4 hours and 11 minutes. He showed him the penetrometer and explained the density protocol. He walked him along the stave rows and demonstrated the sorting decisions. He showed him the slurry consistency by mixing a small batch on a scrap of plywood and having him press his finger into it to feel the resistance. He explained the pour window, the concrete moisture readings, the temperature range within which the bond would fully develop. He did not hurry. He answered every question he asked. He did not make him feel stupid for asking any of them. He did not at any point in those 4 hours reference the day at the burn pile, or the winter rumor, or the phone call to Vernon Kyle, or the conversation with his father at the co-op counter. Clara came out at 10 with a plate of biscuits from the kitchen and set them on the workbench and left again. Rick Thornton ate a biscuit standing up. His notes filled 7 pages of the spiral notebook in a small, careful hand that Emmett would not have expected from him. When they were done, he closed the notebook. He put the pencils in his shirt pocket. He looked at him, and something in his face was different from the face he had walked in with 3 hours earlier. It was not humility. Thornton was not built for humility. It was closer to the look of a man who had spent the morning in the presence of a body of knowledge he had refused to acknowledge existed and was in the process of reconciling that refusal with the actual condition of the world. His voice was low. I owe you an apology. I owe you several. I am not going to try to deliver them all this morning. I will do it in the way that will mean something, which is by telling the truth about where I learned this to every client who ever asked me. If that is acceptable to you, I will consider us square. If it is not, I will find another way. Emmett looked at him. His voice was quiet. That is acceptable. He drove away at 12:22 in the afternoon. Emmett stood in the shed doorway watching his truck turn out onto the county road, and Clara came up beside him, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. Clara's voice, when it came, was mild. Do you believe him? Emmett thought about it. His answer came slow. I believe he means it today. Whether he means it in 6 months is another question. But I did not do this for him to mean it. I did it because he was going to build these floors either way. If he builds them wrong, some farmer's slab cracks. If he builds them right and gives the credit correctly, then the method spreads and the floors last. The method mattered. The credit is a side benefit. Clara smiled, small and slow. She did not answer. She went back inside to finish her coffee. Rick Thornton kept his word. He kept it for the 8 remaining years he ran his business. He referred 11 clients directly to Emmett for work he judged himself not yet ready to execute. He completed 8 stave overlay installations himself using the method Emmett had taught him, and on each of those installations, when a client asked where he had learned the technique, he gave the answer he had promised to give. He named him. He said he had trained him. He said if the client wanted the work done at the highest standard, they should call him rather than Thornton. And he said it in front of his crew, so his crew heard it, and his crew carried the story home to their wives, and the wives carried it into the county at the pace at which such stories travel, which is to say slowly at first and then all at once. Hal Whitmore came out to the Halverson place in the summer of 1973. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in late June with the same manila folder under his arm that he had been carrying to extension service work for 30 years. He asked Emmett if he might walk his floors. Emmett let him in. He walked the floor of the house first. It was 11 years old by then. He crouched at the seam near the kitchen door. He pressed the flat of his hand against the surface. He tapped along a diagonal from the door to the window. He did all of this in the specific, slow, methodical way of a man who had 20 years earlier told a young man that his plan was going to end in a cracked mess and had lived long enough to see the mess never arrive and had come to understand something about his own profession that he wanted to name correctly. When he stood up slowly. He looked at Emmett. His voice was steady but had a small weight in it that Emmett recognized as a form of the same measuring quality his mother's voice sometimes carried. His words were plain. Emmett, there is not a single crack in this floor, not at the seams, not at the perimeter, not where the sun would have opened 1 over 11 summers if the bond were going to fail. I want to write this up for the extension service. I want to publish the method under your name with your specifications, with the performance data from every installation you have done. I want the state to have this." Emmett looked at him for a long moment. He was 30 years old. He had a 5-year-old son upstairs who was afraid of thunderstorms and loved horses, and could already at his age tell white oak from red oak by the color of the freshly cut end grain. I thought about the pamphlet Whitmore had handed him in the spring of 1962 and the honest warning that had come with it. He thought about the fact that he had never in the 11 intervening years come back to him and repeated the warning, though he could have, and he knew from his mother that he had received a phone call from Rick Thornton in the spring of 1962, asking him to steer clear of his project, and had not steered clear. His voice when it came was quiet. "Publish it. Use my name. Cite the installations. If there is any credit to be given, give it to my grandfather first." Whitmore nodded. He did not press him on the grandfather point. He wrote the bulletin over the following 6 weeks. It came out of the Extension Service in the fall of 1973 as a 4-page technical note titled "Salvage Silo Stave Flooring Installation Method and Performance Data from Hardin County." It included his installation protocol in specific terms, the performance data from 11 separate installations across 3 counties over 11 years, and a cost comparison showing the overlay method ran 40 to 60% below commercial alternatives across residential and agricultural applications. It cited Emmett Halverson by name as the originator of the method. It included his mailing address at the request of the State Extension Office, which had been receiving inquiries. 47 letters arrived at the Halverson mailbox in the first 6 months following the bulletin's publication. He answered every one of them. He wrote his answers by hand on lined paper in the same small, careful script he used in his ledger. He did not charge for the correspondence. He considered it in the way he considered many things to be a debt. He owed the men who had come before him, who had built silos in 1921, who had made rules in Rockford in 1908, who had watched a grandson listen to them on a porch in 1957, and had trusted him to carry it forward. The bulletin traveled further than any of them expected. It went into the Extension Service catalogs for Minnesota, Wisconsin, South Dakota, and Nebraska. It appeared in a professional journal for agricultural engineers in the spring of 1975 under Emmett's byline after an editor at the journal had written to him requesting an expanded version. He wrote the expanded version. He sent it in. He was paid $75 for it, which he deposited into a savings account he had opened for his son. The years passed. Clara moved from 2nd grade to 4th. Anders Jr. grew. He was a quiet boy with his father's habit of watching a thing for a long time before committing to a position about it. He worked alongside him on installations from the age of 10. By 12, he could sort staves by density with the penetrometer without supervision. By 13, he could mix a slurry batch to specification. He kept his own small ledger hand-ruled like his father's, in which he recorded observations about grain patterns and moisture behavior that his father read at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings and did not correct because most of what he was writing was already correct. He was 14 years old on the evening in March of 1981 when he came to the supper table with a spiral-bound composition book under his arm and set it down beside his plate before he sat down. The main course that night was pot roast with carrots. His mother was already at the table. His father had just brought the coffee pot from the stove. Anders sat down. He did not open the notebook. He waited until his father had poured coffee for himself and his mother. He waited until he had sat down. He looked across the table at him. His voice was quiet, the same steady quiet his great-grandfather had used when he had something worth saying. "Dad, I've been thinking about the grain elevator in Radcliffe." Emmett set his cup down. He looked at him. He knew the elevator he meant. It had been decommissioned the previous fall. It had been a wooden structure built in 1909, 4 stories tall, with a footprint of about 1,800 square feet at the base. It was scheduled for demolition in the summer of 1981. He had driven past it 3 weeks earlier with Clara and had noted without comment that the outer siding was cypress and the interior framing was probably old-growth pine or Douglas fir. His voice when it came was as still as the surface of a pond at dawn. "What have you been thinking?" Anders opened the notebook. His handwriting inside was small, careful, methodical. He had drawn a floor plan of the elevator interior with dimensions. He had listed the joist spacing. He had counted the boards in the subfloor. He had estimated the linear footage of usable Douglas fir framing. He had calculated the equivalent price of new dimensional lumber at the current lumberyard rate in Eldora. He had subtracted his estimate of the demolition labor cost. He had arrived at a net material value that he had underlined twice. His voice went slower as he spoke the way his father's voice had gone slow 20 years earlier at a different kitchen table. The joists are Douglas fir, 2x10s on 12-inch centers. The subfloor above them is 1.25-inch tongue and groove white oak, 70 years of grain load compression. The elevator is being demolished by a company out of Fort Dodge in June. If we offered to take the materials away at no cost to them, they would probably let us have the interior wood for the price of the demolition labor. I think we could get all of it for about $400. I have priced out the equivalent new lumber at $1,400, not counting what the oak subfloor would sell for if we milled it into flooring. Emmett looked at this notebook. He looked at his son. He thought about a March morning in 1962 when he had been 19 years old and had walked across a frozen field toward a man who was going to laugh at him. He thought about his grandfather's voice on a porch describing what 40 years of pressure did to a piece of white oak. He thought about his mother at the sink not turning, saying, "He's right, Anders." He thought about his father setting a folding wooden rule on the counter beside his coffee cup on a morning he had not slept the night before. He looked at his son. He looked at the composition book. His voice, when it came, was quiet. "You did all of this by yourself?" "Yes." "When did you go to the elevator?" 3 Saturdays. The last one I climbed to the top floor and measured the joists in the North Bay. The demolition superintendent came up and asked me what I was doing. I told him. He said if I wanted to make an offer, he'd bring it to the owner. I told him I needed to talk to you first. Clara was watching her husband across the table. She said nothing. She had learned over 16 years of marriage when to hold her tongue in the presence of things that were not hers to speak into. Emmett looked at the composition book for a long time. He turned one page. He looked at the joist inventory his son had written. He turned another page. He looked at his calculation of the equivalent lumberyard price. He closed the book. He set his hand flat on its cover the way his father had once set his hand on a folded carpenter's rule. His voice was low. "Monday morning. Call them Monday. Tell them we want to make an offer. Ask them what day next week we can come and walk the building together." Anders's face did not change. He was too much his father's son for that. But something in his shoulders came down a half-inch, the settling of a young person who has just been believed. He nodded once. He picked up his fork. He ate his pot roast. Clara reached across the table for the coffee pot. She refilled her husband's cup without being asked. She did not say anything, but she looked at him, and he looked back, and something passed between them that did not need translation. The floor in the house. Emmett Halverson, built in the northeast corner of his father's farm in Hardin County, Iowa, is still there. It was laid in the spring of 1962 from staves salvaged from a silo built in 1921, which means the wood in that floor was growing as trees in the middle of the 19th century was cut and fitted and loaded and compressed for 41 years before it became a floor, and has been a floor for more than 60 years since. The total age of the material from tree to present is something that cannot be purchased at any lumberyard in any state. It cannot be manufactured by any process yet devised. It can only be recognized and only by someone who understands what he is looking at. Hal Whitmore retired from the Hardin County Extension Service in 1984. At his retirement dinner, he gave a short speech in the basement of the Methodist Church in Eldora, and in the speech he made a single observation that a number of the men present would remember for the rest of their lives. He said the most important thing he had learned in 30 years of agricultural advising was that the people most likely to be right about something new were often the people with the least official reason to be listened to. He did not name Emmett Halverson in the speech. He had named him in the bulletin 11 years earlier. That naming had been the one that mattered. Rick Thornton retired from construction in 1979. He sold his equipment. He kept the truck. He drove out to the Halverson place on a Saturday morning in September of that year, and he sat on the porch of the small house Emmett had built at 19, and he drank a cup of coffee with him and Clara, and he said what he had not been able to say in 1971. He said he was sorry. He said it plainly without qualification. He said he had spent the last 8 years thinking about how a man could see a thing so clearly and be so wrong about it, and had come to no answer that satisfied him, except that pride was the answer, and there was no cure for it, except old age, and he was grateful to have lived long enough to feel the cure take effect. Emmett listened. When he was done, he reached across the porch table and gripped Thornton's forearm briefly, the way his own father had gripped his shoulder on the morning of the tape measure, and he withdrew his hand, and he said only this: "Thank you for coming out here, Rick. Thank you for saying that. It cost you something." "I know it did." He nodded. He finished his coffee. He drove home. He died the following spring of a heart attack in his own kitchen before breakfast at the age of 52. Emmett went to the funeral. He sat in the back of the church. He stood at the graveside with the other mourners. He did not speak to the widow beyond expressing his condolences at the church door. He had said the necessary things to Rick Thornton in September on his own porch, and he did not need to say them again to anyone else. The son Anders Halverson went into the salvage lumber business with his father in 1982. They took the Radcliffe elevator down that summer. They recovered 14,000 board feet of Douglas fir joist material and 1,100 square feet of compressed oak subfloor. They used some of it in their own installations. They sold some of it at fair prices to two younger builders in the county who had come up asking to be taught the method. Anders ran his own crew by the time he was 20. He kept his father's ledger practice. He answered his correspondence by hand. He had asked for what everyone else was burning. He had understood it better than any of them. He had built something that lasted. He had built more than a floor, though the floor was the beginning. He had built a way of seeing a thing that other people had already stopped looking at, and he had shown his son how to see it too, and his son had shown his own children in the fullness of time, and the seeing had traveled outward from a quarter-acre of poor drainage ground on the northeast corner of a farm in Hardin County, across a state, and then across a region, and it had traveled quietly without fanfare, in the way that all true things travel among people who have learned to recognize them. The floor is still flat. It is still warm underfoot on a January morning. A person walking barefoot across it in the pale winter dawn cannot help but feel in the specific density and stillness of the wood, the weight of the men who built the silo and the seasons that filled it, and the young man who walked into their leftover work at 19 and saw what they had made. That feeling is the whole thing. It is what he gave to the county. It is what the county now has, whether it remembers his name or not. He is remembered by those who need to remember him. That is enough. That was always going to be enough.